So many people have heard of the first Red Scare. It's kind of important. But we should look at the year 1919 more thoroughly. It's actually probably the craziest year in American history. Hey, Cypher here. Craziest year seems like a big superlative, but bear me out on this one. You'll be surprised how much happened in just that one year. Most people think of the Red Scare as the McCarthy era right after World War II, and the whole beginning of the Cold War. But that's actually the second Red Scare. The first one was actually vastly worse than the second one. Also, not knowing about the first Red Scare is kind of a huge problem in understanding what the Cold War was. We like to pretend that the US and Soviet Russia had no tensions between them up until the Yalta Conference during World War II. And that's just plain foolish because in many regards, the Cold War actually began right with the first Red Scare. And hostilities were there in one form or another throughout the entire existence of Soviet Russia. I've done an episode on the beginning of those hostilities in terms of an actual war, but let's turn and look at the home front. The Red Scare is where anti-communism thrived in American history.
To begin with, World War I had just ended in November of 1918. As people went out into the streets to celebrate, they violated quarantines that had been in place, ensuring another outbreak of influenza, the worst pandemic in US history, actually. People traveling about the world, coming home from the war, didn't help matters in that regard. The political machinery of war proved difficult to dismantle. People were still keeping vigil on supposedly anti-American sentiments well into the next year. The American Protective League, the Bureau of Investigations, and the Military Intelligence Department would play ongoing roles throughout the year despite their original function having officially ended with the armistice. They all turned to look at a new threat. The byword of 1919 was Bolshevism. Since Russia had fallen to communism and we were fighting them there, people saw the Bolsheviks as a threat at home. Anything vaguely associated with revolutionary thought was termed Bolshevism by Americans in 1919. If it weren't for their insistence on connecting everything to that, 1919 probably would have been just another year. Part of the problem was labor was insistent on keeping the higher wages and job security that they had gotten from World War I. There was a wave of labor strikes throughout the year. They began with the Seattle General Strike, which saw the entire city stop working for 3 days and was quickly associated with Bolshevism. Any hint of revolution was threatened with military intervention and quickly quelled. The same thing happened again and again with several major strikes. Many were repressed violently, such as the steel and coal strikes. The most shocking was when Boston police went on strike, causing the whole US to gasp in horror as anarchy ruled the streets for several days, and the strikers were called agents of Lenin. All of this association with Bolshevism did not help the labor movement, which took serious political heat from all of this, let alone all the people killed during strike suppressions. Meanwhile, President Wilson, in all his glorious stupidity, was spending most of his time away from the USA, actually a presidential first in history. He was attending the Versailles Treaty conventions, trying to create the ill-fated League of Nations. He didn't bother to deal with the craziness at home, completely avoiding people who were actively seeking his attention on these matters. He was, in my opinion, the worst president we've ever had, and he showed it by bumbling through the craziness of 1919 and not caring one bit about the people dying in the streets. By the end, he would lose his bid for the League of Nations, having a stroke while campaigning for it, all the while doing this instead of trying to steer the faltering country through its time of need. Instead, the Bureau of Investigation took center stage. There had been a few bombs burst in that year as part of a massive anarchist plot, and one of the bombers accidentally blew himself up while placing a bomb on the leader of the Bureau's front porch. Laughably inept as it was, this caused the Bureau to launch an attack on Bolshevism. And yes, anarchism has nothing to do with communism, but it was lumped into anything to do with Bolshevism. A Senate committee turned everything into a witch hunt, and the Bureau made more raids that year than ever before or since. They swept up a huge amount of people and sent several of them back to Russia, including several famous anarchists who had no part in the original bombings. All of this happened while there was a massive surge in lynchings. Much of it was related to perceived anti-Americanism, but there was also a precipitous rise in racially motivated ones. To make matters worse, there was a wave of race riots in several major cities. Many of these riots turned into pitched battles. Chicago in particular was the worst, enveloping the city for nearly a week of shootings, beatings, and bombings. Of course, all of this was unsubstantially associated with Bolshevism. One commentator even called the riots the Red Summer. To add to the turmoil, the 18th and 19th Amendments to the US Constitution were passed after huge protests for and against it. One created prohibition and the other gave women's suffrage. These were momentous events, but just part of the craziness of that year. Throughout all of this, people were being killed. The death toll was horrifying and innumerable. People who had made gains during World War I lost them quickly. Let's also not forget the US was engaged in several wars as well. It was not a good time to be in the United States. Perhaps the best example of what was happening in 1919 was the World Series of baseball. Remember, at this point in time, baseball was the premier American sport. It symbolized the nation. That year, several Chicago White Sox conspired to rig the games for the sake of gambling winnings. They purposefully lost against the vastly inferior Cincinnati Reds. The players who were part of this conspiracy were forever branded the Black Sox and banned from the sport. The American sport, as well as the contingent American culture, was rocked to its very core by the scandal that ensued.
1919 was a crazy year, and I'm only scratching the surface on this one. There was so much going on. If you're interested, a good book to read is Savage Peace by Anne Hagedorn, or Hagedorn, I don't know how to say her name. And despite its thickness, this book doesn't even cover everything. There's just so much going on. So I'll put a few more recommendations in the description.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and check out some previous episodes while you're at it. I'll see you next time. Quickly quelled. Quickly quelled, quickly quelled, quickly quelled, quickly quelled, quickly quelled. Blah, blah.